So give me 2 seconds to become me. And we're going. So if you've read the program, you know that this is the topic of my talk. And if you know me, you know this isn't the topic of my talk. And I have to tell you why. Part of it you just saw, Gary just held up, was the book. It's out there, it's written. There's a bunch of talks around the content in the book online. You can watch them. And so I've been doing a lot of talks, and sort of I thought, I don't want to do a talk that any of you have seen before. And I just made my mind up about that sort of during the plenary, opening plenary. So I've had a stressful week. But on the other hand, I promise I won't fall asleep during my talk, because if I do, I'm screwed. I don't know what's coming next. Now, partially in deference to the best juggler in the audience, Bonnie, I thought I could have this as the alternative title for the new talk, and it's called Lack of Evaluation and Considered Harmful, Often. But Saul's not here to give it, so which tells you what kind of friend he is. So I thought I'd give this talk. And the color combination isn't an accident. I had and you'll notice it's not a coincidence that this booklet that was going out yesterday has a similar title. It's because I was ranting, which I did once in my life, to Abigail Sellon about the notion of a book called Being Digital that was supposed to be about people and society, and saying that it's completely backwards, that the issue isn't about being digital. The issue that concerns us is about being human. And of course, the challenge in sort of saying that is, what does that mean? And especially, what does it mean on being human in a digital age? And on the other hand, what is our role in promoting the human value in that digital age as people who perpetrate, with the best of intentions, technologies that actually shape the culture and affect the nature of our humanity? So I thought I'd improvise on that after a fashion. Now, the other part of this is that here is this sort of like Lifetime Achievement Award. Well, it's sort of like, well, can I go home and retire now? So my wife and kids will see me. But there's also this sort of feeling that you can't just give any old talk that you've been doing. You've got to say something wise. And the problem is that I don't know what that means. And so every once in a while, I'll probably quote people that I think are wise rather than myself. Something I tried to do in my book, but Richard Harpard wouldn't let me. But the thing is that there is this question, like when you're trying to do things, is sort of saying, so what drives you and how do you get stuff done? Because I guess some of us have done, a lot of us have done a lot of things. And I have to say that the one question that drives all the time that drove me, there were two things that happened. One, I never had security in a sense. I never got tenure. I never did a PhD. I always had to keep going, and you had to prove yourself every week, and there was no luxury to relax. And I started to like that, and so I purposely put myself in that situation because I knew that it got the best out of me. And the other part is that there was this fundamental curiosity that drove and always still drives what I do, no matter what the interests are. But the biggest thing that was curious was about, what are you capable of? What can you do? And the thing is, when you ask that hard enough and you're aggressive about asking that question, and you actually find out, oh, I can do that, there's no satisfaction. All it means is that you raise the bar and say, okay, well, if I can do that, what else can I do? Now, this is a fundamental truth of design as well. There's a guy named Reshler who wrote a book called Unpopular Essays, and in that book, he has this great proof that as a designer and as a creator, you never can succeed. So this is the start of the depressing part of my talk. No matter how well you do, in fact, the better you do at meeting your users' needs, the worse off you are. Because expectations, according to the proof, rise faster than our ability to deliver. And the better you deliver on expectations, the higher all you're doing is setting expectations ever higher. The good news is, because I was told I couldn't be depressing, Bill Gaver said I was being depressing when I told him what I might talk about, is that for the young ones here, you're guaranteed to have a career for life because you never can succeed, but you can get better. But the question is that, again, it comes back, what can you do? And how do you pursue that? And I still don't know, and I'll die when I do. Now, this is a good place to have that conversation. And I'll come to this a bit later, but I talk a lot. I'm really interested in books. I read a lot, but I actually, for the last 2 decades almost, I haven't read fiction. I read more history. And I like explorers. I like people who are reading about people. It's largely what starts saying, who are the examples? You know, how do you set the bar? Right? When I say, what are you capable of? Well, who sets the bar? I have a whole bunch of stuff in climbing literature. And there's this really interesting thing in one of them where some guy at 29 years old wrote his autobiography. I figured that's pretty audacious right off the bat. But he quoted an Australian broadcaster at the end in response to a question that comes up sort of, so, you know, how did you accomplish so much in such a short time, 29 years? How did you do that? And he quoted this Australian broadcaster, said, the question isn't how I accomplished so much. The question is, how is it so many of us accomplish so little? And I was talking to my wife before, sort of, when I said that, because that sounds like almost like, you know, you could shoot me now for that. Sounds like almost like an egomaniac sort of saying, well, I've done so much. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is, how's the bar set about what we expect of ourselves and how we go? And for me, it's trying to look for role models. And I was lucky, and you know, there's 2 things I've been incredibly good at. And the first brilliant decision I made is I chose my parents really well. I thought, really smart. And the second is, by accident largely, but actually not, because there are no accidents, is I got to go to Toronto where 2 people, were actually 3, a guy named Casey Smith, Les Mezzi, and the person you would all know is Ron Becker were there. And they set a standard, an example, so that I grew up in a culture, and I worked in a culture where the bar was really high. I am not a super achiever in terms of any of Ron's students or anyone in that lab. And the thing is, it wasn't Ron. Ron was just the carrier of that. It came from Wes Clark, who was the principal person responsible for Lincoln Lab, and Ivan Sullivan, Bert Sullivan, all the stuff that happened there. And Ron brought that to Toronto. And then he gave it to me. And then it went through, you look at Ravan Balakrishna, you look at Brad Myers, who came through our lab. What I want to talk about is culture, and I want to talk about setting the bars, I want to talk about expectations, and by example, the most important point, I think, is that this can be learned. It can be exported. That the culture within we work and how we set these standards and how we set our values and we set our ethics is something that can be passed on, but it's a design problem more important than any product that we design. And if we get it right, we can make huge difference. I want to come back to the slide. Every once in a while, I might wander. This piece, Saliera, is a saltsetter, is from one of the people who helped set the bar for me. He's fascinating. There's 2 people, because they were just arrested, they were chased by the law, they were just, you know, these guys were outlaws, but did some of the most incredible art. Caravaggio was one of them, and Cellini is the other. He wrote a biography, it's an autobiography, it's a fantastic read, I've read it 5 times. This is a masterpiece. He was a goldsmith, one of the greatest that ever lived, from Florence, when he wasn't being chased out of Florence. But he wasn't happy. He was at a point where everybody else wanted to be as good as him, and all he wanted was to be as good as Michelangelo, right? And so if you went downtown here, you'd see this Perseus with the head of Medusa. He worked on this for 9 years. The cool thing about it is it wasn't just he was an artist. He had to build the pits, the sand. When he ran away had to get out of Italy and go up to France, he was working in Paris. You know, he's just buying a place, digging a hole in the ground, pouring in sand, and learning how to cast, because every time he tried to build stuff like this, he got it wrong, because you have to vent the bronze when you put it out. But he did it. He actually has a piece sitting in that piazza, which was his dream, but it came at a huge price. But he wasn't a sculptor. He just aspired to it. But he was also a craftsman. And he had this thing. And I was talking earlier with Dan. Lothbrook, help me. Brian Shackle. We were doing a workshop with Brian Shackle. And when Dan and I were doing this workshop, I said to him, hey, Brian, what distinguished your students, the ones that really excelled? And he did it, he nailed it right off the bat. And he described Cellini and he described to me as best as I see myself. He said, they were people who had the ability to deal with abstract thinking, to do abstractions, to have their head in the clouds, and yet they had a deep sense of materials and the physical. That they, when they were kids and so on, they worked with Lego, Meccano, they could fix bicycles, they could cook, they worked sewing machines, they could solder, or they could use woodworking tools, but they had some craft with physical materials, and so that it's what I call that as the outside-in stretch. Your feet are firmly planted in the mud, your head is in the clouds, and you can walk comfortably in that position. And in a sense, that's what Chiellini did. Now, we can walk on about that and sort of say, so we talk about stretching the bar. We can talk about what we are capable of and the ways of doing it and the cultural impact of doing so. And what I've been talking about in one sense as the individual is sort of this notion of what can we do? But actually that's the wrong question, of course. Because once we know we can do things, what the hell should we do? And this is the thing that I think what I want to push on today is what about it as individuals and what about as a group, as a collective? And then, of course, this is all just abstraction. It's not real unless we've got something concrete that lets us get there. So how do we do it? And in some sense, the reason I wrote that book is one contribution to say, here's how I think part of doing it is. But it's only a small part. I love this title. In some sense, it was made for me. And so I look at this sense of balance. And the question is how balanced are we as individuals, as a group, and largely in the larger sense, in the larger cultural sense? So when I say this was made for me, this is to prove that I really have had a lifetime. I didn't come out of the womb like this. I really did have hair. And this is the first computer I ever saw. And I'll tell you why I'm not being falsely modest when I say, actually, I don't feel like I've done that much. I've just reproduced what I first started with. In 1971, I was working on this computer at the National Research Council in Ottawa, Canada. It had real-time sound synthesis, real-time color computer graphics. It had a mouse from 1969, that's 1 year after Engelbart's demonstration. I worked there in 1971, it's the first time I saw a computer. The mouse was a carbon copy of Engelbart's, and it was 2 years before Xerox PARC had a mouse, and I did a film soundtrack there. It had a chord keyboard on the left hand, real-time sound synthesis, and an MPEX half-track audio tape recorder slaved to the computer where you could do multi-track recording. Just a sec, two-handed input, graphics, sound. That's what my whole first half of my career was about. I was just copying, getting back what I started with. That set the bar. The touch stuff came from down the hall. There was a guy named Hugh LeCain making musical instruments, all analog with super touch sensitive stuff. That's where I learned about touch. And the point is, all along the way, it's learning from masters. It's not about invention. It's about taking good ideas and growing and setting aspirations. Say, hey, if you can do that, I can do that, and I can make it better because I have some other insight, but will you help me? And if you help me, I'll help the person that asks me for help. And that's a social part of computing. And when we come down this, I look within this as a profession, and this is part of the tension that comes when the sort of designers and the people from a more technical background are going back and forth, is that, sure, we've got this notion of the state of the art of the science, well-defined term and so on and so forth, but the part that I think we need work on in terms of this balance is the state of the science of the art. And how do we use what we know from the science to actually improve the art, the creative, and so on, that balances the state of the science, art of the science? And this is from Donald Schoen, if you know his work, in the sense, we're really good at problem solving, but have we got the balance in the sense of problem setting? In some sense, I think, more often than not, the problem solving is something that you get faster results. So we dive into it because we're addicted to productivity and maximum throughput. But that problem setting is the real, that's harder. And again, the question is, what are the techniques? How do we go about that? In some sense, you need to be informed around that sort of stuff. And our decisions make a difference. But ultimately, and again, I want to keep coming back to this theme of the Renaissance, because how could you not? Look where we are. And the first thing I'm going to say, I'll come back to this as well, is of course the Renaissance man or woman didn't exist even in the Renaissance. Even then, you needed the Medici to be able to support the artists, for example. So you had the venture capitalists as well as the people, whatever you want to read it. But it was workshops, it was teamwork. It was not individuals. There were bright individuals, but they had a great team. But anyhow, we're in a Renaissance type of situation, and we'll go into that deeper. But the players have changed and the culture has changed. Right? We're in a different world. And now the question is, we can learn from the history, but the rules are different. The technologies are different. But we can do different. We've got more power as well. And so these things are cultural. And when I think about that, there's a woman, Gail Moore, who I worked with at Toronto when I was directing the Ontario Telepresence Project. And she told me about this guy named Melvin Kranzberg, who I'd never heard of and I've never seen referred to, but I refer to him in almost every talk I give. Because Melvin Kranzberg wrote an article. I'll confess, I have it scanned. It's under a very obscure publication. I have it scanned. It's on my website. It's hidden. If you know how to find things hidden on websites, then you can get it from there, and then I won't feel like I'm being bad and breaking copyrights. But anyhow, he has a number of laws. And his first law, I think, is one of the most important ones for every one of us to assimilate in terms of guiding how we go forward and how we carry out our craft and our profession. And his first law is this: technology is not good, it's not bad, but nor is it neutral. It will be either good or bad or both. And my corollary, or if you're American, corollary to that, is that without informed design and informed decision-making, it is more likely to be bad than good. I have no proof, I haven't evaluated, that's just my hunch. And the fact is, if that's true, then every time we put a paperclip into an office, we are changing that culture because that's a technology. And the question is, how prepared are we when we decide to design that paperclip to understand the consequences or the nature of the social, cultural, political change that is going to come from introducing that paperclip or that photocopier or that computer or that new software? And my sense is, and Paul Dorsch has talked about this a lot, and so in some sense he should be doing this part of the talk, but it's really important that even though we can't do what we'd like about it, we can't change the world, we should at least be aware of what we're leaving out. Because there might be some small thing in there that we could take into account that could make a difference, that if we did be aware, that we're impotent in many ways about the larger consequences, that we still, just because we can't get it right doesn't mean we can't do our best, because right now it's largely random. By the way, Kranzberg's second law is that invention is the mother of necessity, which basically means when you do put that paperclip in the office, you will get it wrong, but you will get some things right, hopefully, and so the next generation technology is there to fix the things you missed and keep the things that were good. Again, that's because I'm mindful of Bill Gaver's comments. For those of you who are starting a career, that's good news because it means you will always have a job because we will never get it right. There will always be a new thing. But the important thing is everything we introduce is introducing a cultural change. And I really want to say this in terms of 1984, this Orwellian sense that supposedly it's a bad thing to try and design cultures and design societies. But if you believe Kranzberg's first law, we're doing it anyhow, but we're doing it blind without thinking. Because what I'm saying is, if you put something, an artifact or a new system into a culture or an organization, you are doing cultural design. You just thought you were doing industrial design. And so the question is, how do we manage it? Or at least, how do we just keep aware that we're doing it? And the SMS is just one of the greatest things. This has nothing to do with sure, it's got to do with communication, but it's absolutely clear that when, colleagues and people I know developed SMS, they had no idea that they were helping dating and flirting. Or that, in fact, the biggest impact of SMS in the United States was American Idol, where something like 85% of the people who voted on American Idol using SMS was the first time they'd ever done SMS, and it's the only time they had, that was their introduction. That was their only motivation. It was actually to vote for bad amateur. Well, actually, I have no opinions on the quality of things. So this comes down, if these things are cultural, and we need to inform design, and we have to inform how we think, and also inform our research, our prioritizations, and so on and so forth. These are all really important decisions. They're not just scientific decisions, they're cultural and ethical decisions. Then one of the things that at least we can do is we can have a cultural memory, as well as other types of memory, in terms of historical memory. And so I want to just go through a couple design examples to sort of talk about that, because there's some things here that really concern me, and that's what I want to get to. I want to start with one of the industrial designers that I really admire a lot, a guy named Walter Dor-Win Teague. He started his firm, one of the first industrial design firms in the United States, in 1926. The firm is still in business, as are the three other principal design firms that were started in the period 1926 to 1929. And that's remarkable because you remember that was right before the Great Depression. So if anybody tells you design is just a lollipop that you put on if you have some extra cash, nonsense. Those firms would not be in business if they did not bring real value to the companies that they served. I also am putting this here, and I chose an industrial design example because there's probably fewer people here that are familiar with Teague's work than if I brought up something like John Gould. And the reason I want to do that is to say cultural history is important, but remember, we're a very heterogeneous community in SIGCHI, and each one of our disciplines has its own cultural history and our own stories, and one of our biggest challenges is not just to have the responsibility to learn our own cultural history and so that we can articulate it to others, but to do that latter, to articulate to others, because by understanding each other's histories, we understand our references, and we therefore establish a common ground that makes a shorthand where we really can communicate. And God knows we need to communicate better. Now, and by the way, just the quick aside is, I have to say that the best example, perhaps of my entire career, of the nature of what that communication can be was the panel session that I joked about at the beginning about the usability considered harmful. I have never in my academic career been in such a considered, thoughtful, and enjoyable and interesting academic discourse as I had this week. It was worth the price of admission coming, or whatever, just those 45 minutes or whatever it was. Anyhow, 1930, Kodak had cameras. And up until that point, you had to send the camera back to get the film taken out, developed, and they sent it back with fresh film. It came to you. They finally could get it so you could change the film. So the Beau Brownie camera, which you see an example of here, was this new line of these personal digital, they're digital because you use your finger to click them. These imaging devices, right? But here's what Teague did. It was fantastic. He had the idea to actually make it in all kinds of different colors and release them more or less at the same time. So they came out, and not only were they different colors, the materials were really tactile. It's metal with enamel, colored enamel, or ceramics, on top, with colors on the side and the leather. They were beautiful. Look at them. They're fantastic. And I'm thinking here, looking at these and sort of saying, wow, when I saw this, I sort of said, this is fantastic. And the reason I thought they were fantastic is because there's this other designer who in 2004 worked for Apple, Jonathan Ive, with the iPod Mini, and guess what? Now, what I'm trying to say here is not, and get me straight about this, I am not saying that Jonathan Ive just copied this. No, I'm saying Jonathan Ive is a really well-educated and competent designer, and I've never asked him about this, but I nevertheless know he knew about this, and he is working on that in his ideas to generate and bring it up to date. And that is not wrong. That is not ripping off. That is called progress. On my website, you'll find an article that I wrote a while ago, just in January, and it's sort of flipping the long tail that Chris Anderson talked about around to what I call the long nose of innovation. And the long nose basically says, way over here is invention. And then there's work, growing, all low frequency stuff, till finally we become conscious of it, that's generally known, it starts to get traction, that's a high frequency, and that's when people start talking about we invented this. The reason we can talk about the future is because we know from reports that Ivan Sutherland did and later on the National Academy of Science did, that there is no technology in telecommunications and information technologies which went from 0 to $1 billion industry in less than 20 years. Anything that's going to have impact in the next 10 years is already 10 years old. So anything we do to bring forward is referring back to past work of others. So it's not about being the great genius hero inventor. It's about being the person who has the insights, the mining perspective. It's not about alchemy. It's about mining and refining, and like Teague, goldsmithing. Now, there's some other examples there, because I think this is really fascinating, because if you knew about that, if you knew about the history, there's other examples. If there's smoke, there's fire. If you knew about Teague, there's other things like Teague, that when you have a problem and a design challenge, there's this repertoire of things to draw upon. So our challenge is, how do we become more and more literate? So here we have another example of John's, and this is the type of thing, and I'm getting to the point here. So the iPhone, January 2007. Pretty nice design, pretty nice device, no kidding. But in all of the press I read about it, about, wow, a mobile phone that's smart, easy to use, single button on it and touch interface, we'd already completely forgotten in the entire reviews, all the conversation that I've seen on the blogosphere, in the print media, this phone here, which is the world's first smartphone. I have one, it works, it's in my office, and it is the Simon. It was built by IBM in Bell South. It was built in 1993, and it had, guess what? A completely touch interface, one button on it. It had a note taker, it had a calendar, you dialed, and it had an address book. And the question is, it says that these things aren't like these brilliant inventions. They're wonderful insights that build upon a tradition of design. And when I talk about the long nose, what I'm really getting at is, heck, if we actually had a better knowledge of that, some of the issues, both the science and the art, we could give innovation a nose job, right? Shorten it. And it goes further. Back to the iPhone. Think about it for a minute. I'll tell you, I'll confess something to you. That when the iPhone came out, there was sort of a little bit of attention at Microsoft. I wrote a fake press release and circulated it to some of the people, senior people at Microsoft. On the one side was this, and the other side was this. And the comment was, the press release was, Apple re-releases an updated Newton. Now, I'm not taking the mick out of Apple. I have huge amount of respect. Gary made it clear. I'm a seriously competitive athlete. There is no fun being in a competition with somebody who's incompetent. What I'm getting at here is that when we're discussing design and so on, what I really want in terms of informed conversation that actually triggers new insights, new relationships, I want to work with people. I want to have press. I want the discourse to be around saying, hey, in form factor and stuff like that, these are pretty similar. This has a stylus, that doesn't. That's it, and it's color, and it's got a phone in it. But what else is there? And what's similar? What carried across? What isn't? But when we start to see, it's this notion about you don't transform the world by changing things so much as seeing it through different eyes. It's Marcel Proust, if you read the full quote. Now, the reason I'm coming down this is that there's this thing about the level of discourse, the level of commentary. Some of you heard me give this talk about progress of technology. And the fact is, the microprocessor hasn't changed, or the computer hasn't changed in about 40 years or more. The little microprocessors we have today are still von Neumann engines, which an architect like Wes Clark and the people who did the first early computers would still recognize. They're just smaller, faster, cheaper. What's changed more than anything else is who's using computing, where they're using it, what they're using it for, and at what price. The biggest change in computation is not smaller, faster, cheaper, more of them. It's who's doing what, where, when, why, and how, with whom, and for how much. Oh, and by the way, there's still not a computer science department in the world that I'm aware of where in order to graduate with a degree in computer science, it's necessary to have ever written a program that was used by another human being, much less be marked in your ability to do so. Now, mindful of Bill Gaver, I don't want to depress you, so instead of that being a depressing thought, just think about this. If we're doing as well as we are, that being the case, just think if we changed that, what we could do. That's the glass is half full version. But it's not about us anymore. That's the key point. The change is who's using what, where, when, why, and how, and I mean that in a global sense, not in some upper middle class North American office or community. And that says that we have to engage the literacy of the people who are be affected and using our devices for the same reason people like participatory design, so that we don't play designer as God, so that the people affected are literate enough to comment in a literate and informed manner about what we do. Now let's see how well we help them in that. I was flying back from Beijing a year ago, October, with my wife, and this is what she was reading. It's a magazine from the Royal Academy of Art in London. And it was a year ago, and it was a review of a show by Velázquez. I actually had another example I took out of the slides, but it was today's New York Times. Doesn't matter. What I want to tell you is this, or say to you is this, or the observe. I don't care if you're reading a review of dance, theater, architecture, painting, music. It will not get into print in a credible magazine unless it goes deeply into the social, cultural, political, and artistic context and framing of the work. You cannot write about art, or make art even, without deeply knowing the history. Picasso, Dammit, knew the Renaissance painters inside out. But more to the point, the people who listen to Mozart or to Boulez or Stockhausen know the classical musicians inside out. That's more to the point, because there's informed literature to help them, so that there's a circle. It's a virtuous circle. And then on the plane, I was reading this. So I'm a geek. I love technology. I have gadgets coming out my ear. If you come to my office, you will see this. My wife's gallery has got a basement full. I think the one laptop per child computer, the display, is a phenomenal piece of work. It's a beautiful device. It's cute. It's got a pretty neat keyboard. The display is really interesting. The power management is fantastic. It is a wonderful feat of engineering. And yet, the discourse about this is really hard for me to discuss without going through the roof. Because we are so enthralled by the computer and the technology and the object that we left completely, that we write advertisements in essence in the guise of criticism. Observations. Of course, I have no opinions on this matter, but it's sort of like this. Well, it was going to be $100, then it costs $150, but actually it doesn't cost $150. That's the cost of goods. You still have to get it someplace. So that's going to double the cost to get it to wherever it's going. Then it has to get to whoever it's going. So the cost in the hands of a kid is going to be effectively somewhere around $400 to $500. Let's just say that I'm right. Cut me some slack. But the point is this. Then you count how many it goes. And then you sort of say, by the way, Bonnie's sitting there looking at me, and she's got these balls, and I know she's going to juggle to throw them at me, but I'm going to come on her side and I'm going to say, but by the way, have we ever established in any community, and by the way, within 100 miles of Boston, the third world exists. There are places within driving distance of Boston where you can find the third world, where you could take a bunch of $2,000 laptops, give them with the software, and see, does this stuff help people learn and bring the community up by its bootstraps? And then once you've shown that, maybe we can go and foist it off in the third world, where it's otherwise going to create more eco-garbage. But even that, we come back to the sense of sort of saying, but just a sec, it costs $800 to put clean water into a village. That's At worst case, 2 of these computers. Which is better? I don't know. You know what? Because I haven't done the research. I'm not complaining about the project. I'm complaining about the level of conversation, and especially the level of informed conversation about things that are dealing with our world that have huge implications, and no one is speaking about it that's being heard. And my sense is that somebody has to be able to take responsibility to speak to these issues. That a literate, informed one, a balanced one, not an emotional one. I'm being very calm for me. And the point is this. I might be wrong about this stuff, and I'm happy. I'd rather be wrong than right because I'll learn something, but I need somebody who can help me learn. And they sort of say, well, why am I saying this to you? You didn't write that article or either of them. But here's my tip. If we don't do it, who's going to? If we don't get engaged in the public discourse, I can't think of any organization or any collection of professionals better than this one to do it. We're not great at it. We're not trained. This isn't what we're set up to do. But God, look at the other people that might otherwise do it. And the question is, how can we get engaged? And I'm not trying to get us depressed. I'm just trying to say, while we're doing our work and we're going ahead, let's just not forget this part and realize that a certain part of our day maybe, or our week or a year, review one last paper, and for Kai, I hate to say this, and do some public writing. You know, those are the types of things, because ultimately that's what happens. Now I want to give you an example. Oh, and by the way, if you give clean water to those communities, and this is the part where it's really difficult, so I'm not trying to trivialize any of this. Of course, what you do is you save people's lives, especially children's, but if you do that, have you done something to address the problem of food supply then, because the population's going to grow? It's not easy. I'm not trivializing this. But I'd take a look for something we're thinking about now. I have a lot of books. This is just a really small part of it. They're about exploration, stuff like that. I care about books. And then you start thinking about ebooks. I'd like to make a better, I have 3 of them. I'd like to make a better ebook reader and stuff like that. And so I say, well, okay, that's great. Let's do it. But I have a friend called Roger Martin. What Roger's told me is there's a law of economics as strong as the law of supply and demand that says that the actual market price of any product is determined by the lowest vendor. And if the cost of goods approaches 0, inevitably the cost of the product will approach 0. That says that music piracy is not causing the decline of the music industry and music being free, it's just accelerating it. It's shortening the nose. But it also says, and there's a really interesting thing, last year's plenary, Bill Muggeridge, when in his book, $29.95 for hardcover book, 800 pages, color with a DVD, great deal. And he put the book for free online. Well, the way he could do that is because it's cheaper to buy the book than to print it out. And it's not, nobody wants to read with the current technologies. But now, let's assume we can make a reader that's as good as paper or better. That goes out the door. Now people say, well, musicians, and a lot of my friends are musicians and are really in trouble right now, they should go on the road and tour to make money and sell t-shirts to make money and just change the economy. Let's do that. But have you ever bought a t-shirt from an author? Right? And have you ever gone to a stadium to hear an author speak? And so what I'm worried about is that in designing the world's best e-reader, because I want to make something that's green and I want to save the trees, the 50,000 trees that get chopped down every week from the New York Times, there's actually this other problem. And again, I don't know how to deal with this, but the point is that I can't design the technology without at least being aware that I'm affecting a whole ecosystem, and we may well have the most mature ebook readers at precisely the time there are no more authors worth reading, right? And our job, in some sense, if we're doing it because we want to read, as opposed to sell readers, is to say reading is our business, but that means writing. How do we, at the same time, design or think about these parallel structures to keep this within our culture? Because, damn it, it's important. And I want to talk about this briefly. And question, jumping over to Austria, in Salzburg. This question, what if Leopold didn't have a piano? You start saying, what the hell is he talking about? A, remember I'm a musician. I believe if Leopold didn't have a piano, it's entirely plausible that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart could have been the greatest sausage maker in Salzburg. Okay? Because there he is. Now, it's really interesting. Think about what's going on there. That's Mozart, his sister Nannerl, and Leopold on tour, 1864. They toured all over Europe. Now, technology was really important at this time. The piano was changing dramatically. It was going from it just passed from the harpsichord to the forte piano. It was going to the pianoforte. The same thing was happening with violins. We were going from the Baroque violin to the classical violin, the singing violin. Technology was really important. Mozart and his father were deeply involved as beta testers of these technologies. But it wasn't about the instruments. It was about the architecture. Because what's good of having an instrument if you don't have a concert hall? There's no place to play. So you needed architecture, you needed concert halls. But what's the point of having a concert hall if you don't have an orchestra to play in the concert hall? So, you needed conservatories. And so you needed the conservatories to do that. But, actually, you needed to be paid, so you needed the patrons. The Archbishop of Salzburg happened to be Mozart's patron. And to tour, like I showed you, you needed a whole ecosystem to actually move and plan a tour, so when you're 8 years old, you could have already gone to 13 countries in Europe and play. And what I'm trying to say is it's a little bit like minor league sports. If there was no ice, if Wayne Gretzky didn't live in Canada, he'd probably be a welder or a carpenter, as opposed to the greatest hockey player who ever lived. I am Canadian. And the point here is that none of this was cheap. Think about it. Building these things in those days, the instruments, having the craftsmen to build them, to do the innovation, to have the concert halls, train the musicians, to actually circulate the material. It's unbelievable. But that society, that culture made a decision. They said, this is important, and it's cheap at the price based on what we get. And I use this because now we don't just have the Renaissance of Florence as an existence proof. We have Austria and Northern Europe as well, a couple hundred years later, or a few hundred years later. That as a group, as a society, as a culture, as well as individuals, we can, in fact, make a difference. And the question is, you just have to get down to it and say, okay, back to my fundamental questions. What can we do? What should we do? And then how do we do it? Ilya Progeny says, societies don't evolve because their members simply grow old, but rather because their mutual relations are transformed. That's encouraging. I don't want to let Bill down. That's really encouraging if you're 23 years old and you're starting off, because guess what? The technologies we do, if nothing else, can accelerate and help change and transform our mutual relations. I want to go back to that for a second before I come to this one. About a month after 9/11, I was giving a talk at the Guggenheim in New York City. And the most stunning thing about that was that these really bright people said to me, we had no idea people hated us. And I just sat there and sort of said, McLuhan was wrong. Innes was wrong. Fuller was wrong. This notion of the global village as simply coming and popping out for free because of the networks we put in place was naive and idiotic, and predictably so, and they missed it despite their other successes. That simply putting the technologies in place does not mean that people will communicate or communicate about the things that you think might make the world a better place. Again, who knows more about how we might approach that than this community? And again, I'm not saying you have to do this for your thesis. I'm just saying, in your spare time when you're not working on a thesis, just think about it. Maybe when you choose a book to read, think about it, read about it. Oops, I missed that. I got to go back. Although you read it, so I won't. Now the question here is, can you change the world? Can we change society? Can we make this happen? And I have a really strong sense of absolutely yes. And you can do it without wars. You can do it without laws. Let me give you some examples. Gender-neutral language. How did that happen? What can we learn from the women's movement that see what were the strategies and the tactics used to make it so that our language was transformed, at least in English? So if we're not speaking about that, I'll give you another one. How the hell is it that there's no smoking in the bars in Italy or France or Holland anymore, much less in the United States? Because our culture and our society made a decision to transform the culture and society. We had a change of values. How did that happen? What can we learn in terms of cultural history from those types of transformations of people? And believe me, technology was a critical part of it, and communications and information. I show these dogs, that's Digby and Tucker, they're my wife's dogs, because for me, this is the biggest transformation that I would have said, you're off your nut. That I would be walking around at night with plastic bags, picking up after these dogs. And now, if I see you not doing so, you are a sociopath. Right? Right? Our values change. Drinking and driving, take your pick. It's all about the timing. It's about change. You heard it in the first plenary. It's about timing. It's about the transitions. It's not about the states. And the question is, how do we design them? Whether the transitions are right from this screen object to that screen object on our user interface, to the whole thing about where we are in our culture and values today, to where we're going to be tomorrow. I'm going to finish up. This is my optimistic slide. If you're going to read one book this month or this year, read this book. It's not mine. Read this one instead of mine. Or read this one first. It's a climber, Yvon Chouinard. And I don't want to go on about it too much. I just want to say, here's a guy. He was a blacksmith who was passionate about rock climbing and ice climbing. He went to Yosemite. In the back of his car, he had a forge, a hammer, and he would make pitons for climbers, sell them so he could afford to climb. He was a dirtbag climber in the jargon of the trade. Then later, because he liked climbing in ice in the winter, he started to change the shape of ice axes. And so he designed modern ice tools, first person. So now when we climb ice, waterfalls, by the way, people who say I'm a geezer because I talk about waterfall techniques, I know that you can go up waterfalls as well as down. Now, thanks to Chouinard. He started a company, it became Black Diamond, sold the company. Then he started another company that you might know. It's called Patagonia. And the reason this is an important book, and one of the best design books with the worst title that I've read in a long time, is that it's the holistic view of design. It reflects all of the things I've been talking about. What he did in this, when you read about Patagonia, is first of all, they said, we want your underwear. What? You send back your underwear, we'll recycle it and make new. Their products are cradle to cradle. Second, there's no compromise to fashion or style. Their clothes are cool. They're cool colors. In fact, too cool I'm too old for some of them. But they're cool. They're really functional. Then, going off into how they source the cotton, organic. Then they went through and sort of said, we're going to make, I think it's something like 24 2-liter pop bottles to make one fleece. They started recycling non-decomposable things. The company is based on a premise that if the surf's up or it's snowing, you don't work, you go. Because the employees are compensated in their passion as much as they are in their money. So they don't get the same salary as you, but they have a higher pay, probably, in terms of quality of life. It's a decision. And then what they also do is they put a 1% tax on their gross revenue before they pay themselves. So even if they're losing money, 1% of the gross revenue goes to a foundation to go back to the earth that people wearing their clothes are damaging. And the point I'm just trying to get at is, there's an existence proof. Digby tells us we can change the world, and Tucker. Yvon says that if you take design in the large, and you take the ethics and these other things like it, you can, in fact, do a fantastic job and succeed in business. And we can get rid of this notion that business, technology, ethics, and design are opposed to each other. It's just a design problem to figure out how to get it right. And it's not copying that. It's saying, if they can do it, we can, but we have to do it in our way, according to our values, our culture, and our needs. And so, when you read this book, you won't be depressed. You'll feel enfranchised. And so I've done my job in terms of Bill Gaver, so now I can say thank you very much for your attention.